So thank you again. If you feel comfortable, you're welcome to leave your cameras on, or if you prefer, you're also welcome to keep your cameras off. We'll also invite folks to use the chat. If there's any love or comments or questions that you want to share, feel free to use the chat. We will have a Q&A section after Dr. Sepúlveda shares his piece. And so feel free to share those questions with Marisha and I if you want us to ask those questions at the end, and or we welcome you to ask those questions live with us today. Welcome to today's conversation. My name is Dr. Patricia Gonzalez. You are all welcome to call me Patricia. I use the pronoun she, her, ella, and I'm currently the Assistant Dean for the ANS Office of Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. We are super excited for today's conversation, and I know this is a conversation that's close to me, given that my parents were young when they migrated and came to the United States from Mexico. And so really excited to have this conversation with you all and to invite Enrique to dive more into the conversation. About today's event, we just want to let you all know, as anti-immigrant nationalist discourses escalate globally, the book Border Thinking offers critical insights into how young people in the Latinx diaspora experience belonging, make sense of racism, and long for change. Today's conversation with one of the authors in CU Boulder, Professor Dr. Enrique Sepúlveda, invites us to consider how every year thousands of youth leave Latin America for the United States and Europe, and often the young migrants are portrayed as invaders and, if able to stay, told to integrate into their new society. Border Thinking asks not how to help the diaspora youth assimilate, but what the United States and Europe can learn about citizenship from their diasporic, sorry, my English, diasporic youth. And so this is part of the why this is so important, given that a lot of us recognize this experience as not only ours or even our parents, but also people that we love and people that are currently here at CU Boulder. So before I move forward, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Marisha, who's going to do a land acknowledgement for today's conversation. Thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you, Patricia, and welcome everyone. My name is Marisha Lopez. I'm the Program Manager for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the College of Arts and Sciences. And before we get started with today's event, I wanted to guide us through a land acknowledgement. We invite you to take a moment to reflect on your relationship to this land of Boulder and relationship to local Indigenous communities as we are guided by the university's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state and in stewardship to land before the establishment of the state into this present moment. CU Boulder humbly acknowledges that it is located on the traditional and current homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native nations and communities. The violent forced removal of Native people from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. These histories have brought us to the present moment, wherein the University of Colorado Boulder is determined to commit to improving and enhancing relationships with Indigenous communities and issues locally and globally. We will do this by 1, recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty. 2, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge. And lastly, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with Native communities. And Patricia will put a few links for you all in the chat on this topic if you'd like to explore more on your own. So I have the lovely task of introducing you all to today's speaker, Dr. Sepúlveda. Dr. Sepúlveda, the son of Mexican migrant workers, began his career as a bilingual teacher and school principal in North California's Central Valley. These early experiences influenced his dedication to challenging dominant structures that marginalize people based on culture, race, and language. His research primarily focuses on Latinx communities affected by global migration in Northern California, San Salvador, and Madrid. He explores how Latinx individuals and families navigate global migration, citizenship, identity formation, and inequality within transnational migration circuits. Dr. Sepúlveda's work aims to develop pedagogies that deepen our understanding of the lives of migrant youth and communities. Welcome, Dr. Sepúlveda.
Thank you, everybody, for inviting me. Marisha and Patricia, I appreciate this invitation to share this work. That is a labor of love for me. Thank you, everybody, for joining us in this conversation. I just want to give a shout out to my mom, who crossed the border in Piedras Negras, Coahuila, Mexico, and crossed it to Eagle Pass, Texas, so that I can be born in Eagle Pass, Texas. My mom had documentation to cross the borders. For those of us who live on the border, we know that some people have documentation just to cross the border to the border city on the other side. And then my dad had papers to go into the interior to work as a farm worker. So at the time I was born, he was somewhere in Wisconsin in some sugar beet cannery in 1960s, 1962 to be exact. So shout out to my jefitos and jefitas, the ancestors who came before me, who have a major influence in my life, who have passed on. And just to give you an idea of what the border means to me, in addition to having my mom cross the border, but years later in graduate school, University of California, Davis, I'm telling the story to a bunch of friends about my mom crossing the border. And my Chicana feminist queer friends were like pointing out the obvious. And they said to me, Enrique, don't you realize that the moment your mom was crossing this political colonial international border, you were crossing her cervix? And I was just blown away by that commentary that my friends pointed out to me. So the border and border crossing has been part of my life since I've been in the womb. And it's no coincidence that we Chicanx peoples theorize from the margins, from these liminal spaces in and around the border. My ancestors, my elders like to say that we didn't cross the border crossed us. But I tend to say increasingly that, yes, we didn't cross the border crossed us, but the border also landed and pounded on us in material, symbolic ways. And so it's not a coincidence that I join in a long tradition of Chicanx, particularly Chicana queer feminists who've been theorizing from the margins and from the border and from the flesh to think about our various predicaments. So I stand on a lot of shoulders today. I'm also happy to see some folks here who are good friends of mine. Thank you for joining, and to see new folks in the mix. I want to share my screen here. I think I have the possibility to.
You should. Let me know if you don't.
Okay. Can you all see this? Okay.
Yes.
So let me. So the book Border Thinking, Latinx Youth Decolonizing Citizenship, written by my research partner, Andrea Dernes, who's a professor at CU Boulder School of Education, who couldn't be here today. We both come from families who have crossed many borders. Like I said about mine, Andrea was born in Costa Rica. Her mom's side of the family is Costa Rican. Her dad's side of the family is Norwegian American immigrants. Andrea grew up in many parts of the globe. So we share a lot of commonalities, but also a lot of significant differences. And so, but we've been having these conversations about diasporic, marginalized communities, and the thinking that is offered through our embodied experience in these marginal liminal spaces. So I want to start off by saying, so the book itself has multiple case studies of border crossers and examples of border thinking. So I'm going to start off with some examples from my own work in Northern California, looking at undocumented youth and some of the work I did there, and cite some of the research that focuses in the borderlands of the U.S. it will segue at some point to the European context, because another key case study in this book is looking at Latinx youth in Madrid, Spain, and looking at the larger European context of Latinx peoples migrating to Europe, and Spain being a key destination. At one point we had to decide whether we were going to research Latinx people's communities in Madrid or Milan, Italy. At the time, we were doing work in El Salvador, and we discovered while in El Salvador that there was approximately 30,000 Salvadoreños and Salvadoreñas in Milano, Italia, working in the garment industry and as domestic servers. So we went to Milan, Italy, did a reconnaissance research trip to see if that could be a possibility, and it was a possibility. But in the end, we chose Madrid over Milan. But I say that because Latinx peoples are all over the place. They're in Israel, they're in all parts of Europe, they're in Japan, and Australia, as well as migrating within Latinx communities. So this book covers some aspects of European context, some California context, and a Salvadoreño context. In the Salvadoran context, we looked at communities heavily impacted by global migration in both barrio marginados, or low-income marginalized neighborhoods, and also elite communities that sends their children to U.S. universities and colleges. So this book has multiple case studies. I'm not going to cover all of it. We just don't have time. So I'm going to select a few from the Mexican California context and in the Madrid context for today. So, and the first thing I want to first quote I want to draw your attention to is a quote by Ruth Trinidad Galvan, who passed away a few years ago, was a dear friend to many people in my community. I didn't know her personally. I had conversations with her on the phone. But she's a major Chicana feminist thinker and writer and scholar, who towards the end of her life was doing work of Mexicans who were returning to Mexico, even those who were born in the US. And so she was in the middle of that. But this quote that she made in one of her works, and I'll repeat, for those of us born and raised transborderly, we are a country, oops, I can't see the rest of the quote because it's hidden. We are a countryless people, and more this does not sadden me. And so it will become evident as we move throughout the talk today why being transborderly and not grounded in any one nation state and the paradigm that a nation state provides and enforces and surveils and polices, why that is an important social location for us. The next quote, oops, let's see. The next quote is by a student who I'm calling Jesus in my work in Northern California, undocumented. I was doing some work with undocumented Mexican youth, male youth at a high school. And he writes, "Me acuerdo de mi tierra, contemplo la tierra donde estoy, me acuerdo mi vida en mi tierra, y creo que termino olvidando quién soy." And this is Jesus, 15-year-old undocumented migrant student who was flunking out of his classes, who was considered a disciplinary problem, who had a high absentee rate, who was learning English as a second language, and like many of his classmates weren't doing well in school. And so there was a kind of concern at this high school of the general malaise, if you will, and underachievement of this student body called Mexican or Mexican migrant. And I use poetry in my work with them, and they produce some of the most amazing pieces of poetic works that was autobiographical, describing their experiences before they came to the US, the experiences of crossing the border, US border, US-Mexico border, and their experiences here at this school. So a lot of them were within the US within the 2-year period when I came and started doing work with them. The next quote is one of the teachers that Jesus, I'm sorry, and some of his classmates had, and I'll read it out loud. The problem with these students, she's referring to Mexican students, is that their whole world is in Spanish. They're not immersed in English. There's a lot of absenteeism, and they come from a macho culture that treats females with disrespect, especially me, a gringa. Part of the problem is culture. 95% of it is all about assimilation time. Some kids need more time to assimilate. They need time to speed up. They need to speed up the process of assimilation. They need to be integrated more. So this is a quote, but that was a common, that represents kind of a common attitude amongst educators, white educators at school, and to some degree, some Mexican American educators. And this is indicative of the larger nation-state narrative of assimilation and incorporation and integration into society. That the migrants who arrive need to be on this accelerated process of incorporating themselves into the nation-state body politic. So it's a paradigmatic sentiment that forgoes the culture of the students, forgoes the past of the students, where they come from, and it's all about a forward-looking process that's racialized, it's class and nationalized. Leo Chavez wrote a book, The Latino Threat, which encompasses these larger narratives from which assimilation is nation-state narratives cohabitate with. And I have 5 bullet points from Chavez's book where he describes that Latinos are seen as a reproductive threat, altering the demographic makeup of the country. So it's not just a concern about those who are arriving, although that's a huge site of policing, racialized policing, but also the progeny, the offspring of those who arrive, who become citizens. And so even the citizens who have a constitutional right to be here are deemed suspect in this narrative called the Latino threat. It goes on to say that Latinos are unable or unwilling to learn English. Of course, these are all false narratives. These are not necessarily true. Latinos are unable or unwilling to assimilate into larger society. They live apart from the larger society. That kind of interests me. We are segregated. Structural forces segregate to live us apart, and then we get blamed for living apart. Latinos are unchanging and immutable. They reproduce their own cultural worlds, which flies in the face of the actual documented evidence of the rapidly changing worlds of Latinx migrating folks. And the poem by Jesus that I just read a minute ago about, which captures this kind of change in dramatic that's impacting his sense of self. Creo que termino olvidando que soy. I believe that I'm feeling a sense of loss of who I am. So to the white masses or white imaginary of society, they're unable to see the rapidly changing forces that Latinx migrants are undergoing. And then the last bulleted point, Latinos, especially of Mexican origin, are part of a conspiracy to reconquer the southwestern United States, returning the land to Mexico's control. This is why they remain apart and integrated into larger society. This couldn't be, this is kind of ridiculous and would be funny if it wasn't so serious in terms of consequences. But these are some of the narratives that Leo Chavez has documented out there. That there's basically an anti-Mexican, anti-Latinx narrative. And in some of the imagery that you see out there, um, about migration, undocumented migration, you know, exemplified by Trump's candidacy when he announced his candidacy for president of the United States of America. He announced that Mexicans were criminals, thugs, and violators, and so you see this narrative threat in very real, concrete ways from the White House on down. In the European context, you see a similar, albeit different, narrative. In this 2018 photo, the Prime Minister of Denmark, I'm blanking on her name right now, and a lot of the politicians in Denmark were thinking about passing legislation to prevent their immigrant populations from Pakistan, from Turkey, from different parts of the Middle East, to prevent the parents from sending their children home to visit their grandparents, to visit their extended family, their and communities back home, because culture is seen as a threat to, in this case, the Danish context. So culture, the culture of the parents in their home country was something that should not be passed down to the Danish children of immigrants. In these couple of statistics, again, this is from 2016, it hasn't changed much. Many Europeans are concerned with security, economic repercussions of the refugee crisis. I'm sure you've heard some of this in the news a few years ago after the Syrian conflict in Syria. Most of the European countries' populations don't see diversity as a plus, and not convinced that diversity will benefit the country. In an interesting example, which we were kind of struck, and in our conversation with Spanish sociologists, there was a study by Alejandro Portes, who's this almost iconic sociologist from the US of Cuban American ancestry. He's kind of a big shot, big name. And Portes and Aparicio is a Spanish sociologist, did a quantitative study to determine whether the immigrants of the children of immigrants in Spain were assimilating and integrating into society. And there was a basic question in the survey that asked them, do you consider yourself Spanish? And in 2008, the 28% of the respondents said that they did feel Spanish or belong to the nation state of Spain. And then they came back and revisited and asked the same question 4 years later, and that number of yes respondents increased to 48.3%. It was a very simplistic, straightforward, but unnuanced survey, to the point where the Spanish press was celebrating that around 50% of immigrants of the second generation felt that they were Spanish, and they were applauding the politicians were applauding, patting themselves on the back, and telling them, congratulating themselves that they were doing a wonderful job. Our research is diametrically in contrast to this simplistic, quantitative sociological piece. That's not to say that Portes and Aparicio don't have important things to say, or Portes hasn't done amazing work in the past, but in this particular context, we know otherwise. But one of the things we came across was that a lot of the research on immigration is about how they're integrating, how they're adapting, how they're adopting national cultural sensibilities and settling into the nation state. Questions: do immigrants and their children identify as Spanish, the host country in this context, or the US or Germany, or whatever context it may be? Wimmer and Glick Schiller call this types of research as methodological nationalism, where the nation state is the unit that is naturalized and normalized. And a lot of times, even the concepts and the questions are geared towards privileging the nation state. And subsequently, in a lot of the research, if the children of immigrants adopt the identities of their parents or the cultural attributes of their home or their parents' home country, they are seen in a negative light. So the terminology used around second generation who have a positive attitude towards their parents' culture or their home culture, they use language like resilient foreign identities or alienated, confrontational, reactive, militant, oppositional identities. And the opposite is true. On the other side of the continuum, in this nation state kind of binary, those children who assimilate quickly and positively are see themselves as identifying with the host society, see this as a positive thing. And as Portes writes on page 409, this serves as a psychological basis for pursuing upward mobility within it. So integrating, incorporation, adapting leads to positive results in terms of upward mobility. So if young people perceive that they're being discriminated, that could potentially lead to reactive identity. Again, a very negative framing, asserting the foreign identity in opposition to the host country's national identity is kind of like the worst case scenario. The process, Douglas Massey and Sanchez, 2010, right? In the worst case, the process leads to reactive ethnicity with youngsters refusing to abandon their parents' nationality as markers of self-identification. So suggesting the potential for future conflict. So this work situates the culture, the backgrounds, and the identities of parents as risk factors, as something to eliminate, to quash, to overcome. These are two quotes here that came out in our work in Madrid. The first one was an annual report put out by one of the after-school programs that we researched. We researched 2 after-school programs in a neighborhood in Madrid. We labeled this after-school program as ASI. And ASI's annual report, they write, in these spaces, we find families with unhealthy habits and behaviors of sleep, primarily, and of hygiene and nutrition. Furthermore, we detect that 80% of the families represent deficiencies at all levels. And the second quote is ASI is one of ASI's key educators who we interviewed. And she's quoted as saying, they have lived a more European culture. They feel like they're from here. Maybe in their homes, their fathers might be machista, but they know Spanish society is not like that. Well, we know that's not true. They carry that sexism deep inside, even though they've grown up here and everything, and that from the Latino culture. So in our work with the after-school programs, we saw a strong, what we call in the U.S. Deficit thinking, the framing of the cultures of immigrant children as deficient culturally, socially, parenting skills that are lacking or deficient, and don't align with the cultural attributes and sensibilities of the dominant culture of the host country. This is well documented in the U.S. I document some of this stuff myself, and we certainly saw it in the European context. And so integration, incorporation, adaptation to the host country meant to forego this deficit, negative background, and this is promoted by a lot of the sociological research, in the way they ask questions and in the way they come up with the constructs. Even if you think about it, if you stop and take a moment and pause, even the words emigration with an E and immigration with an I emigration being the immigrant who leaves the country of origin, and immigration is the process when they arrive at the host country or country of destination. Even our sociological terms are privileging the nation state. So the nation state is central to our unit of analysis, and we have a difficult time breaking out of these kinds of constructs. Schinkel writes, the genealogy of research on immigrant integration shows precisely this, that the categories themselves, the questions and the modes of analysis of social science cannot be separated from those of the state. Our research choices, which co-shape public discourses and are closely entangled with state policies and are always themselves political. So right off the bat, the constructs that we use, the questions that we develop for our surveys and for our research questions come out of this larger paradigm of privileging the nation state. The nation state looms large in our thinking and filters down all the way down to the teachers who are working with youngsters. So when we talk about our positionality, when Andrea, Divanis, and myself, first of all, we're trained anthropologists of education in the U.S. borderlands. Our methods are informed by our positionality as U.S. scholars in and of the diaspora, who have been socialized by a long history of state racism, of BIPOC and immigrant, migrant, social justice movements, and by personal histories and autobiographies that center the experience of transnationalism and displacement. We bring these experiences to our work with migrant youth and to a transatlantic dialogue with the aim of nurturing new, more expansive and humane methodologies, epistemologies, and citizenship formation. So we know in Chicanx studies and a lot of Latinx studies that we are not only interpolated by the state to think like the state, to privilege state thinking, nation state thinking, but we also know that we are outside of that, or we are outsiders within these borderland spaces, and that outsiderness helps us to think differently because of displacement, because of marginalization, because of discrimination and exclusion. We, in many of our communities, have developed different thinking along these parts. And so the borderlands frameworks that we've inherited from Chicana Latina feminists affords us a different way to think about and to challenge methodological nationalism. So we refuse the gaze of the nation state, locating ourselves in the third space, in between nations, in between social categories. The third space is a space of contradiction, from which emerges pensamiento fronterizo, border thinking which is not confined or defined by any single nation or cultural system. So when you think about Anzaldua's canonical work of Chicana Latina borderlands feminism, Anzaldúa, Gloria Anzaldúa, grew up woman, queer, dark skin, Mexican on the borderlands, and challenging and thinking from the margins of not fitting the cultural gender script of what a woman is, what woman should be, what critiquing heteronormativity within our own family, critiquing being Mexican in the borderlands against white society, but also issues of Indianness and darkness within many Mexican Latinx communities. So these kinds of sources and locations of difference in the flesh, embodied experiences, also become our sources for thinking differently away from these dominant forms of thinking. So we brought Chicana Latina borderlands feminism, we brought diasporic citizenship frameworks, decolonial thinking, and other frameworks to the mix to analyze the experiences of migrants in other parts of the globe. And you see here the kind of piecing together of different frameworks. which is I think in and of itself is a borderlands sensibility, because there is no one framework that can explain the complexities of our embodied experience. And to give you an example, even the idea of a diasporic citizenship in the Chicanx context, we haven't been dispersed. We're not a people of dispersal. We are from here. So diasporic citizenship doesn't quite fit our experiences, but we are made to feel diasporic in our own home, right? And so hence the comment of we didn't cross the border crossed us, or the border landed and plastered on us. So we're piecing different frameworks to try to make sense of our predicaments and to kind of highlight this different thinking. The view from in between, within the third space, we found a more complex reality of belonging. Immigrant, quote unquote, youth have ambivalent relationships with host countries like the US or Spain, and their home countries as well. They navigate multiple forms of belonging in countries of destination and their countries of origin, and multiple forms of exclusion. So exclusion and belonging are sit side by side in these contradictory experiences of being partially belonging to the host country, partially conditionally belonging to the country of origin of our parents, but not belonging to either fully. And so this place of in between affords us to think critically and imagine a different possibilities, if you will. So our work, oops, let me go back. This quote by Orlando Falz Borda, Venezuelan scholar, when he writes, I can't see the first letter, already felt during these critical years of race and gender upheaval, to go beyond empathy and participation, observation into full dialogue and open advocacy, because the study of society is not worth the trouble if it does not help its members to grasp the meaning of their lives and to move to action for progress, peace, and prosperity for all. And so our work, it goes beyond a simple survey, goes beyond participant observation and beyond critical ethnographic methods, although critical ethnography and participant observation are important pieces, but to engage in a full dialogue with our participants and to develop relationships where they become our co-researchers, certain things have to happen. So yes, we observe the cultural milieu of the young people that we work with, but we also train the young people in our work, whether it was in California or in El Salvador or in Spain. We train them to think critically about their own context. So we train them to interview people in their own community, their own families. We ask them to take photographs of their neighborhoods that focus on diversity or lack of diverse spaces in their communities. Our sessions were always dialogical. We constantly dialogued and reflected and wrote. We used poetry to write as a reflexive tool. We had activities that we call identity diagrams to unpack our multiple identities that we live with and deploy. We did dramatization. We used theater. We brought in videos of the experiences of migrants from around the world. We even had conversations with dreamer activists in the United States. We Skyped in dreamers. At the time, Skype was the available tool. And so we use a multiplicity of methods to try to get at these questions of belonging and non-belonging. And so you see that why I would say that Portes and Aparicio's survey was very simplistic when they asked, do you feel Spanish? And so so in one quote by Mariela, she says, And sometimes we had to do a second or third interview with these students, in addition to all the focus groups that we're doing together. Mariela says this, cuando me dicen que soy española, me molesta bastante, porque es como si soy española, sí soy española, pero tengo parte de otro sitio, y no hace ser entera. So when asked the question after multiple conversations, multiple focus groups and interviews and whatnot, and when they went out to interview other people, her question problematizes the simple question of am I Spaniard? She says, well, yes, I'm Spaniard, but I'm also something else. So there's always but. And so that's what we were trying to get at, the but. Yes, I'm Spaniard, but. And so she says that the question doesn't recognize my whole self. And this is what we're trying to get at, the piecing of the whole self. What Ansaldúa would call in parentheses, membering, because the process of assimilation, the process of incorporation to the nation state is a dismembering process. And so Ansaldúa calls for us to remember, to put us back together, to make us whole. In this quote, Rolando, 15 years old, is a fascinating piece for a couple of reasons. I'll just give you a little bit of background. Rolando, father's from La República Dominicana, and his mom is from Ecuador. Rolando was born in Madrid, Spain, but his mom took him back to Ecuador so that her family, or extended family, grandparents, could raise Rolando for a few years while she made money in Madrid. So a lot of times the migrants in Madrid work around the clock. And I don't just mean around the clock in the day, but around the clock all week. And sometimes the children of migrants don't see their parents the entire week. And if they're lucky, they may see them on Sunday. But sometimes they had to work on Sunday too. So she sends Rolando back to Ecuador, and he spends the first 5 years with his grandparents and cousins and uncles and aunts. And then his mom comes back and picks him up and takes him back to Madrid. So he spends the age of 5 to the age of 15 when we got to know him in Madrid, on occasion going back to Ecuador between 5 and 15 years of age. And he writes this: cuando estoy allí, Ecuador, quiero quedarme, pero cuando estoy aquí, no quiero irme. Es así un poco. Then he later in an interview, he says, no me decanto por ningún lado. O sea, ni por el español, ni por ecuatoriano, ni nada. I don't choose either side. Rolando's fascinating because he belongs to multiple places and doesn't belong to both places at the same time. And when he's in one place, he wants to be there. And when he's in another place, he doesn't want to leave. And so he's torn in this seemingly contradictory state of partial belonging and exclusion at the same time. I just realized that this picture, I'm in the background sitting, looking at some notes, I think, in my work with these young people. Racena, 14 years old, writes in one of her poetic responses, autobiographical responses, intentar encajar, conseguir nuevos amigos, cambiar tu forma de hablar, ya nada es igual. Esos días que pasabas con toda la familia ya no pasarán. Unos aquí, otros allá. Pasar días llorando, sola en tu habitación, extrañando cosas que ya no están allí. This poetic response by Racena is a lament, and it's a distillation of complex, powerful emotions of trying to fit in, trying to find new friends, changing your way of talking. Nothing's the same. So it's a profound sense of dislocation, displacement, in a context where the days where the entire family would be together will no longer happen. And when she means what she means by the entire family, we're talking about multiple generation of families back home in La República Dominicana, from grandparents to parents to cousins, kids, uncles and aunts and whatnot. In this dialogue, brief dialogue, Paola says, if you don't fit in, it's okay, I think. Andrea, my research partner, asked, do others agree? So this was a focus group, a conversation between an entire group of about 10 to 12, depending, sometimes 15 students or young people. Paola explains, or I asked Paola, this is me, Paola, explain, if you don't fit in, what happens? Paola responds, it could be that people think you don't fit in, but you have a personality from going to a world that's different from only Spain. Well, you have some different concepts. And it might be that you don't fit in with people in Spain or the people in your country, but you have more knowledge than they do. And even if you wanted to, you're not going to fit in. And that's not bad. So we cite Anzaldúa's La Conciencia de la Mestiza of coming to terms with not fitting in, and the possibility, the potentiality that this not fitting in multiple places, or at least conditional or partial belonging, provides a different thinking, different set of concepts, a different way to look at the world and to critique the world. Here's Racena's reflection in one of her journals. In spite of everything, coming here has helped me to improve in every way. Every day I work harder and harder to be able to reach the goals that I had. Every day I discover new things that I didn't know. Every day I miss my family more and more, every day, every day, every day. Now I have 2 points of view. Now I have different ways of talking. Now I have wonderful friends who I would like to always have at my side. And so, after spending so much time here, which is my country? So she ends off her reflection as a question mark, as a work in progress, as an incomplete process. And we know from Chicana Latina feminist work around identity that it is an incomplete process. But she has multiple points of view here to work from, to think from. In one example that Racena gave to the students in our conversations together, she talked about how she was talking on the phone with her mom, and they were speaking Español Dominicano from La República Dominicana. One of her native Spanish, for lack of a better word, comes up to her and joins her and is waiting for her to get off the phone. She gets off the phone with her mom and then starts speaking Madrid Spanish with her friend. And her friend is startled, and says to Racena, ¿Cómo hiciste eso? How did you do that? And Racena's like, what are you talking about? How did you speak the Español Dominicano on one hand, and then on a flip of a dime, you turn to me and you start speaking Madrileño Spanish? How did you do that? And Racena's like, that's just my experience. That's what I live. And so Racena makes this point to suggest that built into these experiences, painful, no doubt, difficult, no doubt, challenging as all get out, also affords different possibilities, different imaginaries, different places to think from, to theorize from, that affords multiplicity of perspectives. And this is, the students in our group were arriving at these conclusions through our poetic reflections, journal reflections, through the interview of people, through the identity activities, through reflections and dialogue and focus groups. They were beginning to arrive what we would call the conciencia de la mestiza, what Anzaldúa was theorizing, 40 years ago now. Racena continues, I think it's good because that way they being her people and her surroundings, they learn more about what I know, what I can offer to them. And they also offer me things from here, from Spain. Then from here to Santo Domingo, La República Dominicana, I also offer things to them or those myths that they have about Spain, I clarify them a bit. So you see Racena's moving into a space of somewhat authority, confidence, and the realization that she, in her kind of seemingly fragmented world, and her piecing together of these fragments, she's putting together this kind of authoritative, confident, empowered Latina migrant. So embracing the in-between, I'll try to move a little faster here, provides a moment in time, a window, which is not, doesn't exist forever, but provides a window of possibility where unique forms of critical consciousness emerge, and political awareness, civic awareness, and social responsibility. And if the educators in their midst can tap into, this could lead, we argue in the book that this could lead to a more radical democratic possibility, critiquing nation state categories, and to lead to that can lead to more civic engagement, political awareness, and critical consciousness. Students in our work, whether in El Salvador or in Spain or California, became aware, were aware of disparities between countries, knowledge of conditions of scarcity, violence, insecurities in their home countries, and they would compare to the host society. Responsibilities, they began to talk about their multiple responsibilities in contributing to family communities' well-being, and so from here they generated conversations about well-being and responsibility to other immigrant communities. In the context of Spain, they began to look at sub-Saharan African immigrants or North African immigrants to Spain, and looking at similarities and differences with them. So it was kind of a lateral, horizontal gaze. Once they looked at themselves and their experiences, they began to look horizontally, not vertically to the nation state, but horizontally to other communities who had migrated there. You know, this bulleted point about knowing how to value things others don't have, like potable water, was a powerful conversation that we, in what we call the advanced economies, take for granted. The fact that you can go into the bathroom and get hot water like that, or cold water like that, or flush a toilet and it works. That experience of knowing that that is not a given around the globe, and that there's a material, profound, unequal standard of living across the board, is the place to think and to start analyzing why. And so that led to a lot of powerful conversations. Learning to have an open mind, awareness, accepting and developing the multiplicity of perspectives that we have as migrant people at our disposal. As long as there's a recognition and a cultivation of that. We argue in the book that these embodied locations of multiplicity, of multiple perspectives, of looking at things from different angles, both physically, socially, culturally, linguistically, and symbolically, offers a possibility for more radical cultures of resistance against this idea of integrating into the nation state. So we've written in other places how not to think like the state, but to think from this position of marginality and liminality. So embracing the in-between, Andrea did some work with an older group of women. And so one of the chapters in Madrid is singularly authored by her. She worked with Latina feminist activists in Madrid. And in this quote, Elena from Venezuela says, "I don't belong to any one place. No, because I also think that behind that national identity is a permanent emotional blackmail of the state." Sara from Peru writes, I am very aware that I am not Spanish, Spanish being from Spain, that I don't want to be Spanish, that I have an identity that is very diverse identity, but I am thrilled to have this double, triple perspective of having had this distinct life experience, because you are constantly constructing and deconstructing and remembering what and how you want to live. This kind of harks back to Racena's comment of identity in the making, and the multiplicity that comes with it. Oops. So at the core of our work, at the core of our work about exploring the in-between spaces that our migrant lives afford us, and to cultivate that and to theorize from, is this idea of acompañamiento that came out in my work with the California Mexican undocumented youth. I was reading some theological work by a Latino theologian by the name of Goizueta. And I was reading his work, and he was talking about acompañamiento from this Catholic religious liberation theology framework. And he writes, and this quote is from his book, "To be abandoned is to be nobody. To be accompanied is to be honored, a person. The people's accompaniment symbolizes a new honored status as a full human being." And so as I was reading Goizueta, I was also interviewing the parents of Mexican undocumented migrant youth that I was working with at this high school. Jesus, at the beginning, and his poem was one of them. And one of the parents told me her border crossing testimonio, crossing the border around the area of Nogales, Arizona. And she writes about the people on the border who accompanied her in the moment of crossing, through the gallons of water that were placed there by activists, border activists on the border, or by actual physical people who spend hours on the border helping directing people to safe spaces. So there's actually people on the border right now who give several hours of their time and go out in the desert to help migrants and direct them on the way to a safe house or wherever they need to go. And so the woman, La Mama, in my work was talking about she had to come to the border to understand what acompañamiento was and what it meant. And so that concept that Andrea and I develop in the book, we see our work, our methodological, our complex, multi-layered, multi-dimensional methodology as a form of acompañamiento, and along with Salvador's idea that we don't just study people, we engage in full dialogue with them and develop relationships and co-train them to be our interlocutors and co-researchers. That is the main body of our work here, and I'll stop there. And I took a little bit under an hour, so I apologize if I spoke too much. So thank you. I guess we could have the Q&A now.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Sepúlveda, for everything that you share. Definitely brought back memories for myself, and want to open it up for everyone who may have reflection, questions, comments. If you want to use the chat, we also welcome emojis, whatever comes to your hearts and mind at this moment. So we're going to go ahead and make you spotlight you. If anyone wants to unmute themselves, this would be a good time. Thank you, everyone.
I just wanted to call attention to something in the chat that Lindsay Nelson said. We can use the concept of accompaniment to show solidarity with Palestine. We witness their plight and we don't abandon them.
Acompañamiento, being together in this. Thank you so much, Lindsay. And we see your hand, Pilar. Do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Yeah, can you all hear me? Very cool. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Sepúlveda. My question is about this diasporic thinking. I think it's very helpful for kind of disassembling this nationalist methodologies, as you call them. My question has to do with how we avoid kind of this sort of thinking becoming just a way to push the boundaries just a little further back, for example. And so I think the question with Palestine is helpful, as in how can we use this thinking to kind of increase that relational awareness? Because too often I see kind of diasporic discourses not understanding maybe the relational possibility of kind of forming this understanding with Palestine, for example. And so how do we avoid kind of diasporic thinking, reforming kind of nationalistic boundaries just a little further more removed? I hope that makes sense.
Um, what are you thinking about? What do you mean by pushing further? Could you add a little bit more to that?
Well, to me, like some diasporic kind of thinking is going to align itself to nationalism, just a nationalism that's more removed, maybe just a more to my origin, but still a nationalistic boundary, just not one that's centrally located in a way.
Yeah. So we look at the word of, and I'm going to see if I can Lok Siu, who wrote an important piece of work. I'm going to pull it up here. Can I share screen real quick? Let me share a screen. So memories of a future home, diasporic citizenship of Chinese in Panama. And so we really latch onto Dr. Siu's work. I think they're at Berkeley right now, because it is a framework that looks at diaspora in a different way from what we have traditionally viewed it. And so and it's against a nationalist thinking. It is about reconstructing home in the diaspora away from home. But her work offered us a different way to think about diaspora against a nationalist frame. But like I said earlier, I mean, for us Chicanx in the borderlands, we're not diasporic people, although we were made to feel that way. And so we have to look at other frameworks that help us to kind of unpack some of this stuff. But I would point to her work to see if that helps to kind of think through a little bit more and to kind of flesh out diaspora and move it away from a nationalist frame. We found her work to be very impactful. But like I said, earlier, there's no one frame that can explain our complex predicaments and our embodied experience. And so we need multiple frames that kind of shore up and to get at. And one of the things I learned over the years is that us scholars are in a constant search for frameworks to try to make sense of fast changing human phenomenon, and I tend to think that that frameworks, when we latch onto one framework, I think we miss something in trying to understand human predicaments and human phenomenon. And so, yeah, I think that's one way to kind of get at your question, but probably not the only way.
And I appreciate that. I'll check out that book. Thank you, Dr. Sepúlveda.
Yeah. And we could talk more. I mean, you can email me even. We can have more conversations if you're on campus. I'd be happy to
Yeah, I
continue
love
the
to.
dialogue.
I'm reading through your book right now, and I'd love to follow up with an email later on for sure.
Sure, yeah.
Anyone else? And we're seeing some love, Dr. Sepúlveda, in the chat for you. Much appreciation and reflection as well. Anyone else would like to ask a question or a comment, a reflection, anything that came up for you?
I had a question, kind of a selfish question, but my family is from Puerto Rico, which, offers a lot of benefits in that, we are technically US citizens. But I felt like I related in a lot of ways to things that were being said. And, my mom will constantly tell me whenever she's unhappy with what the US is doing, she will say, I'm not American. I'm not American. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not American. And I wonder if is there any research that you know of being done around that sort of the disbursement of a culture like that in the United States, and the high pressure from me, or not from me, from my parents to assimilate into the culture here, but also having that citizenship, so it's not quite the same.
Yeah, you right off the bat, I mean, there's multiple works that I can probably, I'll need time to think about, but right off the top of my head, Nicholas D. Genova, D.E. Genova, he's done some work, and I'm blanking on who the other scholar was, but him and this other scholar, Puerto Rican scholar, did some work with Mexican and Puerto Ricans in Chicago. So you might want to look up Nicholas D. Genova, and that'll lead you to the work. But I can, if you email me, I can definitely come up with some more work by Puerto Rican scholars. I lived in Connecticut for 12 years. In fact, I was living in Connecticut when we moved to Spain to do this work. And I lived in the Puerto Rican community. And I remember going to a talk at the city hall, and a Puerto Rican politician was coming from Chicago, Gutierrez. I'm blanking on his first name, Gutierrez, House of Representative from one of the Chicago districts. And this was right after Trump had announced his candidacy, and Gutierrez, Representative Gutierrez, said this to the mainly Puerto Rican audience. He said, "They're talking about Mexicans. Trump is talking about Mexicans as criminals, as thugs, as whatever. But he goes, ojo, they're also talking about us." He goes, it isn't just about Mexicans. That's the boogeyman that they're bringing up, but they're talking about us too, and they're going to come for us. So we need to be in solidarity. And I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that consciousness among Puerto Rican. And I was certainly treated like a brother in the Puerto Rican community. People thought I was Puerto Rican until I talked Spanish, my Mexican Spanish. But yeah, there's a lot of important work by Puerto Rican scholars about this. About on paper, Puerto Ricans are citizens, but in practice, they're second, third class citizens, right? Yeah. So, yeah, send me an email, and I'll shoot you some. I'll send some references.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.